Hi, this is Christopher Perrin. I'd like to talk to you just briefly about a famous passage about teaching in Luke chapter 6. It's that passage where Jesus says, "What would happen if a blind man led another blind man? Would they not both fall into a pit?" You know that passage, right? Well, in the context of Luke 6, there's some other things going on. This is the same passage where Jesus says that we're to love our enemies and we're to bless those who persecute us. And he says that we're to be merciful to those. We're to be merciful because God is merciful to us. Be merciful even as your Father is merciful. And then he says, by the same standard by which you measure, it will be measured back to you, pressed down, pouring forth into your lap. Maybe you remember that passage as well. Well, it's right after that that Jesus talks about the blind man. Let me read it to you. He says, he also told them a parable right after this passage. "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher." So the context is one of reciprocity. Judge not that you not be judged. Be merciful as your Father is merciful to you. Love even your enemies because God has loved you. And then he moves to this passage about the blind leading the blind and the teacher who's fully trained. I think what's going on here is that Christ is addressing what it means to help build disciples and out of love, edify others so that they become like a tree planted, echoing Psalm 1. That follows this passage. Or be like the house that's built on a rock rather than the sand and that can stand the winds of a storm. That's the context of Luke 6. And there's this little passage about the blind leading the blind and a teacher being fully trained. So what is it about a blind person leading a blind person that has anything to do with teaching? Because right after that verse is the verse that says, when a student has been fully trained, he'll be like his teacher. They're in parallel. They're interpreting one another. It's kind of a Hebrew parallelism there. Well, here's what I think is going on. What kind of a teacher is a blind man? It's a contrast. This is the way you don't want to be a teacher. You don't want to be like the blind leading the blind. A good teacher is someone who sees very well and can take others along to see what he sees. By contrast, a great teacher is someone who has been there before, has seen some truth, goodness, and beauty, and is bringing along a student in order to help him to see what he has seen. Have you ever been on a tour of some beautiful place? Would you like to go, say, on a tour of Rome or the Metropolitan Museum of Art with a good tour guide, or would you like to just do the self-guided tour? Especially if you're in a foreign country. If you're doing a self-guided tour, you're spending most of your time looking at the map and not seeing the beauty that's all around you. But when you're with a great guide, you don't have to look at the map. You can look at the beauty. And a great guide starts teaching you and showing you things that you otherwise would not be able to see because your eye is not trained like his eye is. Have you ever seen or heard people discuss great art? Sometimes on the radio I hear people who really know music well discussing what they hear, say, in a symphony or an opera or even contemporary music. And I'm always amazed by their vocabulary and their insight. Sometimes I don't even understand what they're saying because they can hear things that I can't hear. Have you ever been standing in front of one of those crazy posters that's 3D, and you have to stand in front of it and stare at it cross-eyed for a while until finally it pops into 3D? I remember having the experience of doing this where my friends were saying, I see it, and I didn't see it. And then finally, I looked cross-eyed long enough, and I saw it. Well, a great teacher helps others to see. They're not like the blind leading the blind. They know how to avoid the pitfalls, and even beyond that, they know how to make the student like the teacher himself. Because when a student has been fully trained, he'll be like his teacher. Maybe this is the mercy that comes back to the teacher. Maybe this is the love that comes back to the teacher. How is a teacher merciful? He's merciful to his student. How is a teacher loving? He loves his student. And what is it that he receives back in exchange? He receives a student who can surpass even himself. He receives a student who can see what he has seen and then perhaps even see beyond what he's been able to see. That's a great joy to a teacher, to see a student be able to do that. But there's an ethical dimension to this as well, and I'd like to conclude with this, because right after the passage about the teacher training a student who becomes like himself, Jesus says this. He says, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you yourself do not see the log that is in your eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye." Do you see the ongoing theme of seeing here in that passage? Jesus is using seeing in an ethical way to describe getting rid of that which is affecting you from noticing what is true, good, and beautiful, from growing as a follower of Christ and knowing God himself. So, apparently, what a teacher needs to do is pull out the log that's in his own eye. That's how he avoids being the blind, leading the blind, because daily he is repenting. He is himself asking God to help him to be the kind of teacher who will have the kind of sight to even pull the speck out of his student's eye. And that takes careful vision and very precise vision indeed. Have you ever had to pull a speck out of someone's eye? So there's a sense in which the teacher is still a student, right? The teacher is still taking care of his own eyesight, his ability to see and understand and to know, even as he's trying to do the same thing for his students. So there's a measure of humility that comes to being a great teacher. I think this passage shows us that. The great teacher is always pulling the log out of his own eye. He always assumes that there's a potential for pride, for laziness, for intemperance. And as he's seeking to help a student to be just the opposite, to be a sighted, well-sighted student, to actually become a teacher like himself, he is daily dealing with himself, daily repenting. So perhaps a great teacher is like a well-sighted guide who finds that his own labor of love returns to him in a student who becomes like him and even surpasses him. I encourage you to think about that as you continue your own work as an educator and teacher.